Hello, I'm Mat McLachlan and thank you for joining me for this presentation about the Cowra Breakout. Sorry I can't be there in person, but by the time you see this, I'll be on a plane on my way to Gallipoli. This is going to be a bit of an interesting format, both for me and for the conference, but I'm sure it'll work out well and you'll learn a lot about the Cowra Breakout. So thank you once again for joining me for this presentation. So my presentation today is on the Cowra Breakout, and as I've called it there, a World War II battle on Australian soil. And I'm going to make the argument that this was a battle, not an attempt for freedom from the prisoners. So the overview is that on the 5th of August 1944, more than 1,000 Japanese prisoners rioted at the Cowra POW camp in regional New South Wales. Although the incident is commonly referred to as the Cowra Breakout, the prisoners' intention was battle, not escape. And this is a misunderstanding I think we have about the breakout, because this was not like a civilian breakout where the goal was freedom. For the prisoners, this was a chance to rejoin the war effort, to reclaim their honour and to earn the glorious death that had been denied to them on the battlefield. And I should say as well that this is a fairly brief summary of the breakout, and if you're interested in reading more about it, you can check out my book, which I wrote about it in 2022, called The Cowra Breakout. So let's talk about the origins of the camp. It was originally built in 1941 to house Italian prisoners who'd been captured in North Africa. But by 1943, it had expanded to include Italians, Japanese, Koreans, and Formosans. Security at the camp was pretty patchy. The fences were very low. There were few guard towers and only a small garrison. And I think that Cowra's isolation was considered the dominant security feature. It was so far away from everywhere, it was 400 kilometres inland, that it was felt that no one would try to escape because they knew they had nowhere to go. So this was a bad misjudgment. The garrison battalion is very interesting, the 22nd Garrison Battalion. They've been unkindly called misfits in some sources because they were too old or too unfit to do frontline service. And so they were men who were too old for service, for frontline service. They had injuries that prevented them from serving, or some of them were returned service people who had been fighting in the front line and had been wounded perhaps and were not fit enough to go back to the front. So the one thing that we can say about them is it wasn't exactly a prime gig being stuck in rural Cowra guarding a bunch of Japanese prisoners. So there was a lot of resentment from the guards, and that would show itself during the breakout. So let's talk about the camp. Here's a map showing the camp, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail when we talk about the breakout itself. But this shows the layout of the basically circular camp. 4 compounds. A compound with Italians, B compound holding the Japanese NCOs and privates, and we'll talk about that one specifically when we talk about the breakout. C compound also had Italians, and D compound was a mixed bag of Japanese officers, Formosans and Koreans. So the layout of the camp, it's a pretty big place, about 100 acres. So we had this central thoroughfare called Broadway that divided the camp, and also a cross thoroughfare called No Man's Land, which separated the camp. There were fences around the camp, 3 rows of fences. You can see them here in this photo. Very low, only about 5 feet high, really like farm fences of barbed wire. Some barbed wire in between them, but as you can see, this was not much of an obstacle to a determined escape attempt. In terms of the barracks, here's where the guards slept, north and south of the camp. But let's look at the guard towers as well. So these black dots here indicate guard towers. So 2 towers at the north, 2 towers at the south, but then ridiculously east and west, only 1 tower on each side. So this eastern tower, F tower, was going to feature very prominently in the breakout. Also, I wanted to talk briefly about the positions of the machine guns that were put in to help prevent the breakout. There's one here called gun number 1. So these are both Vickers guns, gun number 1 and gun number 2. It's been said that the guns were set up to fire directly into B compound, but I absolutely don't think that's the case. The men who installed these guns were experienced soldiers, and they knew how machine guns worked. And obviously, if you had guns set up here, it would have caused havoc for the rest of the camp. So I believe the guns were set up to fire along the fences. That number 1 gun would fire in this direction, and number 2 gun would fire in this direction. And I think the evidence suggests that's exactly what happened during the breakout. So let's talk about the Italians, the first prisoners at Cowra. They were an odd bunch. They were pretty docile prisoners. Most of them had not been great soldiers, and they were happy to be out of the war. In 1943, Australia introduced a work program for Italian prisoners, noting that they were very docile, and also many of them came from rural backgrounds, which meant they often worked and occasionally lived on local farms, completely unsupervised. And unsurprisingly, this led to a lot of fraternisation with farmers' daughters, and in some instances farmers' wives as well. So it was quite scandalous, these dashing Europeans thrust into the Australian countryside. So a good story about the Italians that I enjoy telling was that a group of them was sent out on a truck on a work detail one day, and in the evening when the truck was due to come back, it got a flat tyre, and by the time the Italians had changed the tyre, the camp was locked down for the night and dark had fallen, and the Italians had to bang on the gates of the camp to be allowed back in to the prisoner of war camp. So interestingly, thousands of prisoners who had been in Australia during the war returned after the war. And if we look at a place like Griffith in New South Wales, which has a very strong Italian community, that was started by Italian former prisoners who came back after the war. There was a slight issue with fascism amongst the Italians. It wasn't all fun and games, but those fascists were dealt with by being put in a separate compound in the camp. Here's a couple of photos of the Italians doing their thing at Cowra, always with big smiles on their faces. So let's talk about the Japanese at Cowra, who are a completely different story. So many were tied to the value honour clause of the Field Service Code. This said, strong is he who comprehends shame. Be always mindful of the reputation of your community and family while making every effort to fulfil their expectations. Do not in death leave to posterity a stain on your honour by having suffered in life the disgrace of being a prisoner. Now, we should point out here that this doesn't specifically say that the Japanese had to take their own lives rather than be captured, but it was as near as made no difference, especially for the soldiers in the front line. And the mention of family and community is vital here. When a Japanese soldier went off to the front with flags and cheers from his community, he wasn't being thanked for his service, he was being thanked for his imminent death. So it was expected generally that when a Japanese soldier went off to fight, he wouldn't be coming home. And so this created a real issue for Japanese who had been taken prisoner. The word they often used was ghosts. They were trapped between a life they could never return to in Japan, but also the honourable death that had been denied to them on the battlefields. And so this created a real crisis within the Japanese soldiers, extreme internal turmoil. Should they live or should they die? And this made them recalcitrant and very difficult to get on with. There were certainly no work details outside the camp for the Japanese prisoners. And the Japanese were fairly well looked after. They were given lots of food and shelter and warmth. They played baseball, they tended gardens in the camp, but they were still very moody and recalcitrant. This was always going to be an issue that would create trouble in the camp. I wanted to refer to something here that I call the POW barometer, and what I mean by this is that the prisoners at Cowra reflected Japan's flagging fortunes in the war. As more prisoners arrived, not only did they make the camp more crowded and create more tension in the camp, but they also brought with them stories of defeats all across the Pacific. And so in early 1943, there was only a handful of prisoners in the Cowra prison camp, Japanese prisoners that is. By August 1944, there were more than 1,100 prisoners in the camp. So it was a pretty untenable situation. A lot of the prisoners had been taken in New Guinea as that campaign failed for the Japanese, but also a growing number of POWs who'd been captured by the Americans at Guadalcanal arrived later in 1943. And throughout it all, there was a steady stream of downed airmen and marooned sailors who arrived at the camp as well. And the attitude of the airmen and the sailors, particularly the airmen, tended to be quite different to the soldiers. And the reason is that it was pretty easy to stick to the Field Service Code when you were comfortably set up in an airbase or on a ship. It was much harder when you were lying in the mud in New Guinea facing death every day. So the NCOs, the airmen, they tended to be a lot more fanatical. The airmen in particular tended to be a lot more fanatical. They were also seen as quite elite. They were corporals and sergeants instead of mere privates. They were better educated. They were seen as elite within the Japanese military forces. So they naturally became the leaders of the camp, and they were also the troublemakers because they tended to be the most fanatical. Now, this situation was untenable. It couldn't last, this seething resentment of the Japanese, and they felt that they had to do something, especially now that they realised that Japan was seriously in danger of losing the war. And so there were lots of indications that the Japanese were planning to do something. So there'd been riots at other camps around the world. So in Noumea, Japanese officers had risen up and threatened to commit group suicide. But most notably at Featherston, New Zealand, a group of Japanese prisoners refused to work. The guards opened fire and 48 Japanese were killed in that riot. And that was in 1943. So there were lots of indications that the Japanese in this environment would act up. There are a lot of whispers in the community of Cowra that the Japanese were up to something, particularly from Korean labourers who were released from the camp to work at places like the railway. But then finally there was conclusive proof that the Japanese were planning an uprising when a Korean informant spilt the beans, and his name was Lance Corporal Matsumoto, and he overheard Japanese prisoners talking about a breakout, and he duly informed the authorities. So the Australians now had conclusive proof that there was a plot to break out of the camp, and the question was, what were they going to do about it? This is one of the most frustrating aspects of the entire story of the Cowra Breakout, is the inability of the Australians to do anything to stop it. And I've said before that my book really should just be one page long, and it should just say that in 1944 the Japanese prisoners were planning an uprising at Cowra, the Australians found out about it and shut the whole thing down. And that would have been the end of the story, but sadly that wasn't the case. And so the camp commandant, Colonel Monty Brown, he did beef up the security. He put in place 2 Vickers guns, 2 Vickers machine guns, but then he got 8 Owen submachine guns, which he allocated to the garrison, and 100 grenades. So that was all he did. And curiously, he didn't ask for extra men to guard the compound. So 1,100 prisoners guarded by 108 Australians. It was a very odd decision not to get more men. But eventually he made the authorities made the decision, which was a sensible decision, to move all of the privates from the camp in B compound to the camp at Hay, which was further inland from Cowra. And so the decision was made that this move would occur on Monday the 7th of August. The privates would be moved out of B compound. But then a disaster occurred. Colonel Brown informed the prisoners 3 days before that the move was coming up. So they were due to leave on the Monday, and he informed them on Friday, August the 4th, that they would be leaving. It was an absolute disaster. He was going to move the prisoners to stop them rising up, as they knew they were planning to do. And now he's giving them 3 days' notice. The reason for this was a little bit complicated, but Australia was always worried about Australian prisoners in Japanese hands, of which there were tens of thousands. And they felt that even though Japan had not signed up to the Geneva Convention, that they should give the Japanese prisoners the same treatment as they would receive under the convention, in the hope that this would encourage the Japanese to take care of the Australians. And obviously that didn't work. The Australian prisoners were treated terribly by the Japanese. But Lieutenant Colonel Brown took this one step further at Cowra, and he decided to give the Japanese prisoners of war the same treatment, the same rights that civilian internees would receive, which was far more extensive than what the prisoners were entitled to. So in this vein, he felt that he was obliged to tell the Japanese prisoners of war that they were being moved to Hay. He was completely wrong. There was no obligation to tell the Japanese, and in fact, they should have just marched in the morning of Monday morning, on August the 7th, and simply marched the Japanese onto trucks and sent them off to Hay. There was no reason to give them notification, and in fact, this precipitated the violence that he was trying to avoid. The other issue was the machine guns were not manned 24 hours a day. It's completely ludicrous. The gunners were told to sleep in barracks nearby to the guns, and at night time come out and man the guns if required. And also the machine guns needed riflemen to support them, much like an aircraft carrier needs destroyers around it. But the riflemen that had been allocated to the guns were even further away. They were in A Company barracks, several hundred metres away. So it was always going to be very difficult to get to the guns in time if they were needed, particularly at night time. The Japanese weren't sitting idly by, of course. They were also making their own preparations, and they began preparing as soon as they heard the news that the privates were being moved to Hay. And this occurred on the afternoon of the 4th of August, as soon as they left the meeting where they were told. And so they decided it could not be allowed to happen. They had to take action. So they put plans in place very hurriedly that evening. And famously, the prisoners were asked to vote on whether they wanted to participate in the breakout by writing a circle meaning yes or a cross meaning no on a piece of toilet paper. And probably about 80% of prisoners voted yes to the breakout. But it's also important to note that there were 3 quite distinct groups of prisoners involved in this election. The first one was the fanatics. This was a group of prisoners that very strongly wanted to participate in the breakout, wanted it to occur, and they put a lot of pressure on other members of the compound. There's also those who were very strongly opposed, who surprisingly did receive a hearing, the people that spoke out against taking action. And in fact, men who said, I don't wish to participate in the breakout, in many cases did not have to. They simply stayed in their huts during the breakout. There weren't many of them, but there were some that spoke out against it. But the vast majority of the Japanese prisoners, you would say, were fence sitters, somewhere in the middle. They didn't necessarily believe very strongly in breaking out of the camp, but they felt in a very Japanese way that once the decision was made, it was their obligation to go along with it, even though that probably meant death. So again, very Japanese, the way the decision was made. A number of men who couldn't participate in the breakout due to ill health decided to take their own life in the evening before the breakout, so usually by hanging themselves in front of their comrades. And the Japanese began fashioning weapons from whatever they had on hand, baseball bats, knives, anything, lumps of wood, anything that they could get their hands on, and also began stacking firewood beneath the huts to set fire to them during the breakout. So the plan, and this is really important to understand these three aspects of the plan, and this is what indicates that this was a battle as far as the Japanese saw it, not an attempt for freedom. So the first step of the plan was to take control of number 2 Vickers gun and to turn it on the Australian Guards in the camp. The second part of the plan was then seize control of the entire Cowra prisoner of war camp, and then thirdly, quite astonishingly, to then march on the army training camp that was 3 kilometres away and take on the Australians in that camp. So they were pretty clear that their role was to kill as many Australians in uniform as they could. It's an important distinction. The Japanese were told not to take any action against civilians, and they followed that throughout the breakout. So this was a battle against Australians in uniform as an attempt to regain their honour. Let's talk about the breakout itself. This occurred on the evening of Friday, in the early hours of Friday, August 5th, 1944. So it was about 2 a.m. In fact, just before 2 a.m. because one of the Japanese prisoners lost his nerve and ran to the fence and was yelling to the guards, trying to alert them that the breakout was coming. But he was not understood by the guards. And what happened next was the breakout began and that prisoner was killed pretty swiftly by the prisoners breaking out. So this man featured in this photo is Hajime Toishima. He was a Zero pilot who was shot down in the first raid on Darwin on February 1942 and became the first Australian prisoner of the war, the first Japanese to be in Australian hands. And he blew this bugle that's depicted here to signal the start of the outbreak. And that bugle is actually in the collection of the Australian War Memorial. You can see it when you go down to Canberra. So it's a pretty important document, a pretty important relic of the battle. And so there were 4 groups of Japanese that broke out of B compound. 2 groups ran into Broadway, and we'll talk about that in more detail. 1 group headed for the fence towards F Tower, and another one headed for the most important part of the attack, the attempt to capture number 2 machine gun. And so let's talk about that in a little bit more detail, what happened in each stage of the campaign. So the attack on Broadway. So we had 2 groups here. The North group ran towards the main gates in this direction, and the South group ran in this direction, and their plan was to break into D compound here and release the Japanese officers so they could participate in the breakout as well. But I should say that nearly 600 Japanese successfully broke into Broadway, but it was a disaster for them. Once they were in Broadway, they couldn't get out. There were guard towers at each end which opened fire on them, and also Australian guards ran to the gates and blasted away at the Japanese and settled a lot of old scores in this firing. And so even after their officers told them to stop shooting, many of the Australians kept shooting, seeing it as their chance to get revenge on the Japanese. So it was an absolute bloody disaster, the attack on Broadway. And here's a quote from one of the Japanese involved. "The guards in the towers, although confused by the emergency, turned their searchlights on us and showered us with intense machine gun fire illuminated with red, blue and yellow tracer. People all around me went down like 9-pins. I could hear groans everywhere. As it was impossible to move down the centre of the road, we crawled along the drains on either side, climbing over the dead in the hail of bullets. Finally, we reached a heap of corpses near the officers' gate." And one of those corpses was Toishima, the man who'd blown the bugle. He was shot in this area down near the southern gate in this area, and he ended up taking his own life with a knife he was carrying after being wounded. So the attack on this sector of Broadway was pretty bloody and didn't achieve much. I have another quote here from an Australian. This is what he viewed. "There were bullets flying and ricocheting everywhere. It was a strange sight to see the Japs going around the huts with old knives and goodness knows what, and the next thing you would see an officer appear with a rifle or a revolver and having a shot, and it was hell on earth for a while. There must have been several of our blokes that must have been hit, some not very seriously. They would land in the ambulances and we'd run them into Cowra Hospital." And he was actually quite correct. A number of Australians were wounded by friendly fire and taken to hospital. It's a miracle more weren't killed by the fire of their own comrades. So that was the attack on Broadway. Let's now talk about the attack on F Tower. And this is where most of the Japanese who got out of the camp got through, because this entire eastern eastern arm of the camp is only protected by F tower, and there was only one person in the tower the night of the breakout. It's ludicrous to think they knew there was a breakout coming. They'd already told the Japanese they'd be moving, and yet they didn't think to put more men guarding key positions like F tower. Poor old Private Kevin Manser was in F tower completely on his own, and all he was armed with was an Owen gun, his personal rifle, and a handful of grenades, which he couldn't even throw because he didn't have enough room to lift his arm in the confines of the tower. So completely useless, couldn't do anything except watch the Japanese burst through. And burst through they did. Here's another account from a guard as to what he saw at that sector. The prisoners came out of their huts screaming, "Banzai, banzai." They charged the fences like a mob of stampeding bullocks. You've seen crows rise up off a dead sheep when you fire a shot at them. Well, that's how they came up and over those fences. So about 300 Japanese managed to break through the fences at this point. About 25 were killed here, and I think they were killed not by poor old Private Manser and his Owen gun. I think they were killed by machine gun fire from number 2 gun sweeping down this way. But about 25 were killed, but more than 300 got through the fence at this point. Now, the main part of this battle occurred around number 2 machine gun, so let's talk about that. So let's introduce two fellows here who really were the heroes of the Cowra Breakout. This is Privates Ben Hardy and Ralph Jones. They were asleep in this barrack here in B Company Barracks. They heard the breakout occurring. They threw on their army greatcoats over their pyjamas and ran to the gun with their boots unlaced. So they fought this battle in their pyjamas. And it was a race to the gun between the Japanese who were breaking out and Jones and Hardy. And interestingly, the Japanese actually wanted to lose this race because they wanted the gun to be in action. They knew that they didn't understand the workings of a Vickers gun very well, so they wanted the Australians to get it into action before they took it over so they could swing it on the rest of the compound. And so Jones and Hardy rushed to the gun. They fired only about 85 shots before the Japanese overwhelmed them, and sadly they were both killed. They were beaten and stabbed to death. One of the things they did do, which was vital and which is why they were so heroic, is they disabled the gun. And now it's been said that they did that by taking out the lock, which is the firing mechanism, which loads and fires the rounds. I don't believe they did that. And in fact, an Australian who got to the gun said the lock was still in place. What wasn't in place was the feed block. And the feed block is the mechanism that feeds rounds in from the canvas belt into the gun. And the feed block was hanging down by the side of the gun when the Australians took it back. And so I think it's fairly obvious what happened is Jones and Hardy, when they realised they were going to be overrun, like every machine gunner throughout time has done, they simply ripped the feed block out of the gun so that it couldn't be used. And that was the case. The Japanese could not use the machine gun to turn it onto the Australians. And so once the gun was disabled, the Japanese didn't really know what to do. They milled around for a while, then the survivors scarpered off into the bush. So most of the Japanese who were killed in the breakout were killed in this area in front of number 2 machine gun. Many, probably more than 100 were killed in this area. Again, I don't believe that was fire from Jones and Hardy from this gun. Well, it couldn't have been. They only fired 85 rounds. It had to be fire from number 1 machine gun firing along this fence line. But this was where the bulk of Japanese were killed during the breakout around that gun. And basically that was it. That was the Cowra Breakout. It lasted probably only an hour. All this carnage occurred and 300 Japanese escaped from the camp. Now it was time to try and round them up. The more than 300, I think it was 378 Japanese who got out of the camp during the breakout. Now it was time to round them up. And this photo here depicts the scene sort of the next morning of a dead Japanese lying in front of the, again, very low fences with blankets flung over them so that the Japanese could escape. So the search began with the garrison from the camp, also army recruits from the army training camp, and also the local police. And we should pause here to remember this gentleman on the right. This is Lieutenant Harry Doncaster, who was a veteran of North Africa, and he was at the army training camp training new recruits, and he was sent out at 4:30 in the afternoon. He was sent out with other men from the army training camp to try and round up prisoners, noting that it gets dark less than an hour later at that time of year in Cowra. So they didn't have a lot of time, and crazily they were ordered to go out effectively unarmed. The recruits that were searching for prisoners were told to carry bayonets in their hand, not even take unloaded rifles, but just to carry bayonets. They were considered too green to use their rifles, which was ridiculous. But even worse than that, the officers leading them were told to be completely unarmed. No guns, no pistols. They didn't even carry their sidearm. And the justification that was given was that a lot of Japanese had already been killed and they didn't want more getting killed by untrained recruits. and making the problem even worse. But it was a ridiculous decision, and poor old Harry Doncaster paid the price because he came across a group of Japanese. The men with him scarpered, and Harry Doncaster was last seen throwing rocks at the Japanese and eventually using his fists to try and fight them off. But he was overwhelmed and sadly beaten to death. So that was just a sad and unnecessary chapter of this whole sorry saga. Some of the Japanese that escaped committed suicide. A couple threw themselves in front of a train. Others hung themselves. There was a pretty disquieting incident where a farmer with a shotgun was out in the bush trying to help round up the prisoners, came across a group and ended up shooting 2 of them dead with his shotgun, which could have been a pretty big diplomatic issue for the Japanese government. They were trying to, keep this quiet as they could in front of the Japanese government, and the idea that civilians were out shooting Japanese prisoners was not going to go over very well. So even the roundup wasn't handled particularly well, and it was 9 days before the last Japanese prisoner was finally brought back into the camp. So pretty harrowing days for the poor old people of Cowra. And the cost of the breakout, which really never should have occurred. Well, let's have a look. It was the largest prison escape in World War II, and I think the largest in history. There was one account of a jail in South America, a civilian jail, where several hundred people broke out, but this is certainly one of the largest prison breaks in history. 1,000 Japanese participated in the breakout, and 378 of them managed to get out of the camp. 234 Japanese were killed, which is an extraordinary number killed, and 5 Australians were killed. So Hardy and Jones on the Vickers gun. A private, Charles Shepherd, who was stabbed by a Japanese prisoner as he came out of his barracks. Harry Doncaster, as we mentioned. Plus, my research indicated a 5th soldier. Normally people only refer to 4 Australian soldiers as having been killed in the breakout. But I identified there was a bloke called Tom Hancock, who was a member of the Volunteer Defence Corps. And he was in Blaney, the nearby town, guarding the railway lines. And one night, as he got out of his ute, his mate who was with him, his 303 accidentally discharged and badly wounded Tom Hancock, and he died a few days later in hospital. So I think absolutely Tom Hancock should be remembered as one of the Australians killed in the breakout. He was killed on duty while acting in his capacity as a member of the Volunteer Defence Corps. He was given a military funeral. His wife received a pension. There was a military inquiry into his death. But he's not recorded on the Roll of Honour in Canberra for reasons that are not explained. And it's not because he was in the VDC either, because there's a couple of dozen blokes from the VDC on the Roll of Honour. So for whatever reason, he's been missed. So I've been lobbying the War Memorial in Canberra to have his name added. I think it's only fair that he be recognised as the 5th Australian killed during the breakout. The aftermath of the breakout, there were several military inquiries, but I think it's safe to say there was an absolute cover-up, basically because the army was greatly embarrassed by the failings that led to the breakout in the first place. The Japanese government was informed soon after the breakout, but the Australian government were fearful that they would retaliate against Australian prisoners. But luckily the Japanese gave the Australians a get out of jail free card by declaring that this can't have happened because there are no Japanese prisoners of the Allies. And so that relieved the Australians that there wouldn't be any further action from the Japanese. A curious part of this whole saga was that the commandant of the camp, the Japanese leader in B Compound, Sergeant Kanazawa, was tried for murder. It was put forward that since he had knowingly participated in the breakout and Australians had been killed, that he was responsible for their murder. He was, of course, acquitted of that. You can't be convicted of a murder you didn't actually participate in. But he did spend the rest of the war locked up in solitary confinement. So he was still punished for his role in the breakout. And the big irony is that the survivors of the breakout were moved to Hay Camp. They couldn't stay in Cowra. They burnt down their huts and destroyed the camp. They had to be sent to Hay. There was nowhere else for them to go. So in a weird irony, the place that had caused the breakout, the threat to move them to Hay, was where they all ended up anyway, which is really quite ironic. And also, surprisingly, is they didn't cause any more trouble once they were in Hay. They were sort of model prisoners for the rest of the war. So it's perhaps because that the main troublemakers had been killed in the breakout. That might be the reason. Or it simply might have been that they got it out of their system in Cowra and didn't want to be involved in any more violence. But as it was, they didn't cause any more trouble, and most of them were repatriated back to Japan in 1946. And I just wanted to talk about the legacy of the breakout. So the first thing to say is that Hardy and Jones in the 1950s received the George Cross for their efforts on the machine gun, which is the equivalent of the Victoria Cross, but for actions that didn't occur in the face of the enemy. And even though the Japanese were obviously the enemy at Cowra, because they were prisoners, they were considered non-combatants. So Hardy and Jones received the George Cross rather than the Victoria Cross. But I also have to say that I think this is the last time this highest honour was issued to a Vickers gun team. Obviously a lot in the First World War and some in the Second World War, but I think this was the last time a Vickers gun crew received that highest honour. After the war, an extraordinary thing occurred when because the Japanese were reluctant to admit that they even had any prisoners in Cowra, they certainly didn't want to pay for the maintenance of a war cemetery. So the Japanese consul here in Australia basically helped fund and build a war cemetery for the Japanese that had been killed in the breakout. But that cemetery now also includes every Japanese national who died in Australia during the war. So about 600 people. So the guys that died in the breakout, airmen that were shot down over Darwin, sailors whose ships sank off the coast of Australia, but also a lot of civilian internees, which is a very sad part of the story. So old people aged 80 down to 10-month-old babies. So about 600 Japanese nationals now interred in that cemetery, and it's the only Japanese military cemetery outside Japan. There's also up here the Australian part of the cemetery, which includes Jones and Hardy and the other men killed, and also men killed in training accidents in the training camp nearby. And then in the 70s, the beautiful Japanese garden was built in Cowra, which is quite incongruous because it looks like something you would see in Kyoto or Osaka in the middle of the Cowra bush, which is really quite extraordinary. But it should be said that the silver lining of the Cowra breakout, even though it never should have happened, was that it forged very strong relationships, very strong reconciliation between Australia and Japan. It became the focal point for reconciliation. And this is a picture of Mr. Murakami, the last survivor of the breakout, who I was fortunate to meet during the 75th anniversary, but sadly has died since then. But I wanted to end on a really sad irony of the breakout, which is that the men who died in the Cowra breakout, the Japanese who died, are the ones who never relieved themselves of the shame that they felt, because their families then received information that these men had died whilst prisoners, and many families refused to believe it and said, my son never would have been taken prisoner. So the men who died were the ones who never escaped the shame of being captured. The men who survived, conversely, somewhat ironically, were able to go back to Japan and live long, happy lives, and to put their service and their captivity in some sort of context for their families, and also to look back decades later in that very different perspective we now have about the Second World War. And so the men who survived the breakout were the ones that were most able to tell the stories, and sadly the men who died were the ones who were burdened with that shame, even in death. So thank you for listening to the story of the Cowra Breakout, the battle on Australian soil. If you have any questions or want to know any more, please do message me at matt@battlefields.com.au. But enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you for listening to this presentation.